Before everything fell apart, I believed my son was my greatest blessing, the one person in this world who would never make me question my worth or my sanity. He was the child I had prayed for in quiet moments, the child I had carried through long nights when he was sick, the child whose laughter could ease any sorrow. When I lost his father, the grief threatened to consume every corner of my heart, but I held on because of him. Because even when my own strength wavered, I still had someone to protect. And maybe you felt that too, the quiet certainty that love would always hold everything together. If you've ever faced betrayal, please share your story in the comments. Your voice deserves to be heard. In the years after my husband's funeral, I found purpose in small rituals. Every morning, I rose early to brew my coffee and sit by the kitchen window, the same window where my husband and I once planned out our dreams for the future. I tried to keep those dreams alive, even if they now felt like they belonged to another lifetime. My son would come by on weekends to check on me, or so I believed. He would bring groceries and insist on carrying them inside, telling me to sit down and rest. He would pat my shoulder and say, "You've done enough, Mom. Let me take care of it." I thought it was kindness. I wanted it to be kindness so badly. I remember the way he used to look at me when he was young, those big brown eyes, so full of wonder and trust. He'd hold my hand in the supermarket, afraid of getting lost among the aisles, and I would squeeze his fingers gently, promising him that I would never let go. I meant it with every cell in my body. No matter what happened, no matter how old he grew, he would always be my little boy. The boy I stayed up with through fevers and heartbreak. The boy I defended when the world seemed too cruel for someone so gentle. Even as he became a man, I still saw glimpses of that child. When he held his own son for the first time, I thought, this is what it means to keep a family together. I believed our love would be the anchor that held us through every storm. I believed I had done something right in this life because he had turned out to be a good man, or so I thought. The truth is, I chose to look away from the first cracks. The little signs were there, but love has a way of making you blind to the things you don't want to see. Sometimes he would correct me when I repeated a story I'd told before. "Mom, you already said that," he'd sigh, with a trace of impatience that stung more than I admitted. Other times he'd remind me, almost jokingly, that I was getting a bit forgetful these days. He'd say it with a smile, as if it were a harmless observation, something we could laugh about. I would smile back because I didn't want to cause tension, but a small knot of unease began to take root in my chest. I told myself it was normal. I was getting older after all. Maybe he was just trying to look out for me. Maybe it was my own pride making me sensitive. But late at night, when the house was silent, I would replay those conversations over and over, wondering when exactly I had become someone he felt entitled to manage. Despite the doubts, I still wanted to believe in the goodness I thought he carried in his heart. When he offered to help me organize my bills, I was relieved. When he said he would handle the property taxes so I wouldn't have to bother, I thanked him. When he insisted I give him the spare key, just in case, I handed it over without hesitation. Because trust is easy when it's someone you raised from infancy, someone whose first steps you applauded, whose scraped knees you bandaged, whose future you sacrificed everything to secure. And so I let him into every corner of my life, believing I was safe in his care, believing he still saw me as his mother, not as an obstacle to be managed or a burden to be shifted onto someone else. In those quiet mornings, sitting alone with my coffee, I still felt something like peace. The light would spill across the kitchen table, catching the silver threads in my hair, and I would think, I have lived a good life. I have loved and been loved. It never occurred to me that the person I trusted most would be the one to try to take everything I had left. People like to imagine betrayal as something sudden, a sharp blade, a single moment that changes everything. But I have learned it often begins slowly, like a thin crack in glass that spreads quietly until the whole pane shatters. Looking back, I can trace every hairline fracture to those harmless jokes, those soft sighs, those moments when he looked at me as if he no longer recognized the woman who had given him everything. If I had known what he was planning, I wonder if I would have done anything differently. If I would have held back my trust, protected my boundaries, questioned the motives behind his offers to help. But at the time, all I saw was my son, the boy I once cradled against my heart, the boy I would have laid down my life to protect. I see it clearly now. Every small concession, every moment I bit my tongue to keep the peace, every time I laughed off the sting of his words, it was all leading to the day he would stand in front of everyone I loved and tell them I was no longer capable of making my own decisions. But back then, I still believed he would never betray me. I believed he would stand by me the way I had always stood by him. I believed love was enough. I was wrong. It didn't happen all at once. That's what I want people to understand when they hear this story. If my son had looked me in the eye one morning and declared that I was no longer competent, maybe I would have fought back right then. But betrayal doesn't always announce itself with a shout. Sometimes, it slides quietly into your life wearing the mask of concern. It began with errands. He would stop by in the afternoons, sometimes unannounced, holding a folder in one hand and a soft, patronizing smile in the other. "I've got your mail, Mom," he'd say. And before I could reply, he'd sit down at the kitchen table and start sorting it himself. I would stand there, feeling a little displaced, as he flipped through envelopes, murmuring about deadlines and fees, as if I wasn't capable of understanding them myself. At first, I told myself he meant well. It was easier to believe that than to face the nagging suspicion that he was quietly taking control of things that weren't his to manage. He began asking questions that sounded innocent if you didn't listen too closely. "Have you been remembering to pay the utility bills? You know, with everything going on, it's easy to forget." Or, "Maybe I should hold on to the checkbook for a while, just so you don't lose track." I didn't want to argue. I didn't want to sound defensive or ungrateful. After all, he was my son, and I thought he was helping because he cared. So I said yes. Yes, you can look at the bills. Yes, you can hold the checkbook. Yes, you can take the spare key. Looking back now, I can see exactly how each of those yeses chipped away at the life I had built for myself. But at the time, I told myself it was just easier to let him handle it. I was tired. I was lonely. And part of me liked knowing he was around, even if he sometimes made me feel small. Gradually, his visits took on a new tone. He stopped asking if I needed help and started telling me what he was going to do. "I'll set up autopay so you don't have to worry about these," he said one afternoon, not even glancing up to see my reaction. "I'm going to move some money into the joint account, just to keep things organized." That was the moment I felt a chill in my chest, a sudden clarity I couldn't ignore. This wasn't about helping me. This was about control. But when I tried to assert myself, to remind him that I was perfectly capable of managing my own affairs, he would soften his voice and tilt his head, the way he used to when he wanted something as a boy. "Mom," he'd say gently, "I'm only thinking of you. Everyone forgets things sometimes. It's nothing to be embarrassed about." It was such an effective tactic, wrapping his manipulation in the language of concern. How could I argue without sounding unhinged? How could I defend myself without proving his point that I was irrational? So I bit my tongue. I let him do what he wanted because it was easier than starting a fight I wasn't sure I could win. He began mentioning things I supposedly forgot, conversations we'd never had, decisions I'd never made. "Remember, you told me you wanted me to handle the taxes this year," he'd say. "You signed the paper, Mom. You don't remember?" The first time he said it, I felt my stomach drop. No, I hadn't signed anything. I was certain of it. But when I looked at him, all I saw was certainty. He looked so calm, so sure of himself. For one terrible moment, I wondered if I was the one who was mistaken. And that was how it started, the slow erosion of my confidence. Every time he insisted I'd forgotten something, I felt a little less sure of my own memory. Every time he spoke for me, I felt a little less steady on my own feet. He was so gentle in his condescension that I almost didn't see the damage it was doing. Almost. I began to dread the sound of his car in the driveway. I would hear the door open and feel my heart sink into my stomach. He never knocked anymore. He didn't feel he needed to. He would walk in, set down his things, and greet me with that same bland smile, as if it were perfectly normal to waltz into my house and rearrange my life. When my sister called one evening to ask how I was doing, she mentioned something that made my breath catch. "Your son says you've been a little confused lately," she said cautiously, as though trying not to upset me. "He told me you've been mixing up names and getting lost on errands. Are you sure you're all right?" I remember gripping the edge of the countertop to steady myself. Confused? Getting lost? None of it was true. But it didn't matter that it wasn't true if enough people started to believe it. I tried to laugh it off. I tried to reassure her that everything was fine. But after we hung up, I stood in the kitchen for a long time, staring at nothing, feeling the cold realization settle in my bones. He wasn't just telling me I was forgetful, he was telling everyone else, too. That was the night I started writing things down. Every bill I paid, every conversation I had, every appointment I scheduled. I filled notebooks with dates and details, determined to have proof if anyone ever questioned me again. It felt absurd, documenting my own competence like a criminal trying to prove their innocence. But in my heart, I knew I was right to be afraid. He hadn't declared open war yet, but the first skirmishes had already begun, and I was determined that if he ever tried to finish what he'd started, I would be ready. It's strange how quickly people can begin to doubt you once a seed is planted. That was the part I wasn't prepared for, the way suspicion grew in the minds of people who had known me for decades, all because of a few carefully chosen words. At first, I thought it was only my son who saw me differently, but little by little, I started noticing it in everyone else. My neighbor, who used to wave cheerfully every time I brought in the mail, began speaking to me with the same tone she used for her grandchildren, slightly too loud, slightly too slow, as if I couldn't be trusted to understand her. When I went to church on Sundays, I saw the pity in people's eyes. "If you ever need someone to drive you," one of the deacons offered kindly, "just let us know, you know, in case you forget the way." I nodded and thanked him, though inside my stomach churned. I had been driving that same route for 30 years. I could have done it blindfolded. I told myself it was nothing, just people trying to be helpful. But the more it happened, the more I realized these weren't innocent misunderstandings. This was a story someone had been telling behind my back, and that someone was my own son. It came to a head one afternoon when I stopped by the pharmacy to pick up a prescription. The woman behind the counter smiled sympathetically when she saw me. "Oh, sweetheart, your son already called ahead," she said. "He told us you sometimes get mixed up about your medication, so we put everything in a special packet for you." I could barely respond. My cheeks were hot with humiliation. I took the little white bag, thanked her in a voice I hardly recognized, and walked to my car with my hands shaking. Mixed up? I had never once confused my pills. I was methodical to a fault. I had raised a child, managed a household, survived the loss of my husband, and kept every detail of our life in order. And now, without my consent, he was rewriting the story of who I was. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time that day, trying to understand how the boy I loved could do this to me. I wondered if he had convinced himself it was kindness, if he told himself he was protecting me from my own supposed decline. But deep down, I suspected he knew exactly what he was doing. He was setting the stage for something bigger, something final. The realization settled like a stone in my gut. If he could persuade the pharmacist, the neighbors, the congregation, what was to stop him from convincing the courts? What was to stop him from taking everything I had left? I thought of my husband then, and a part of me felt relieved he wasn't here to see this. He had always believed the best of our son, just as I had. In all the years we raised him, we never imagined that love could be twisted into leverage, that gratitude could curdle into entitlement. When I came home that afternoon, I took out one of my notebooks and wrote down exactly what the pharmacist had said. I wrote down the date, the time, and every word I could remember. My hand trembled as I gripped the pen. I felt like a woman recording evidence of a crime no one else could see. I didn't tell anyone how bad it had gotten. Part of me was ashamed, though I knew I hadn't done anything wrong. And part of me still wanted to believe he would stop before it went too far. But as the weeks passed, it only escalated. I began to hear that same careful phrasing repeated by other people. She gets a little confused sometimes. She doesn't always remember things. She's getting on in years, bless her heart. Always said with the same sympathetic smile, the same patronizing kindness. One evening, a woman from church stopped me on the sidewalk. She took my hand in both of hers and leaned in close. "I'm so sorry about what you're going through," she whispered, as if I were dying. "It must be so hard to lose your memory." I looked into her earnest face and felt something inside me snap. I pulled my hand back and stood straighter than I had in years. "My memory is fine," I said evenly. "What's hard is realizing the person spreading these lies is my own child." She blinked, startled, and took a step back. But I didn't care if it made her uncomfortable. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of something that wasn't fear or shame. I felt a spark of anger. And that anger was what finally gave me clarity. I went home that night and began gathering everything I would need. Bank statements, medical records, letters from my doctor confirming I was of sound mind. I placed them in a locked box and slid it beneath my bed. It wasn't enough to know the truth myself. I would need proof when the time came. Because by then, I no longer had any illusions. This wasn't going to stop on its own. My son had decided I was in his way, and he intended to remove me, piece by piece, reputation by reputation, until there was nothing left but a caricature of an old woman too feeble to stand up for herself. But he had underestimated me. He thought that because I was quiet, I was weak. Because I loved him, I would be blind forever. He was wrong. It's a peculiar thing, the moment you realize there is no going back. No explanation, no apology, no act of contrition could ever make you feel safe again in the presence of the person who betrayed you. I reached that moment on a damp, gray afternoon that began like any other, with a phone call I almost didn't answer. It was my sister's voice on the other end, sounding hesitant in a way that set my nerves on edge before she said a word. "I think you should know," she began carefully. "There's been some discussion. Your son called me and a few others. He said he's worried about you." I felt my heart start to beat in my throat. "Worried about what?" I asked, though I already knew. "That you're not, well," she said, as delicately as she could. "That you're confused most of the time, and that it might be time for someone to take over your affairs." I closed my eyes. For a moment, the room spun around me. My voice, when it finally emerged, sounded thin and foreign. "Did he say that exactly?" "Yes," she whispered. "He said you'd been signing papers you didn't understand, that you got lost coming home from the store, that you've been forgetful." I pressed my palm flat against the table to steady myself. Forgetful. That word again. That ugly, insidious word that had become the cornerstone of his campaign. My sister cleared her throat. "I told him I hadn't seen any of that in you, but he sounded so concerned. I thought, maybe he was telling the truth." For a moment, I almost wished he were, because if I were truly losing my mind, then at least I would have an explanation for why everything felt so wrong. But I knew better. My mind was clear. My memories were intact. This was not confusion or age or illness. This was a calculated attempt to steal my life out from under me. When we ended the call, I sat in silence, staring at the neat stack of documents I had begun to compile. My medical records, my bank statements, my will, my proof that I was still myself. I had been gathering them like someone preparing for a storm, hoping, naively, that it might pass without touching me. But in that moment, I understood the storm was already here. He wasn't going to stop. He wasn't going to pause out of guilt or affection. He had decided that my independence was inconvenient, and he would not be satisfied until he had erased it completely. I wish I could say I was only angry, but the truth is, I was heartbroken. There is no betrayal quite like the betrayal of a child. I had carried him in my body, nursed him when he was sick, stayed up all night helping him finish school projects he'd left until the last minute. I had forgiven him every small cruelty, every childish selfishness, because I believed that love would eventually make him kinder. But love, I was learning, does not always lead us to the same place. My love had made me patient and trusting. His love, or whatever remained of it, had curdled into something sharp and acquisitive. I think that was the moment I stopped hoping he would come to his senses. I stopped telling myself that if I were just more understanding or less defensive, he might remember that I was his mother, not his burden. Something inside me hardened. I would not surrender the last years of my life to anyone, not even my own son. A few days later, he called to say he wanted to come over to talk. His tone was gentle in that practiced way he had perfected, the voice of a man pretending to be patient with a confused old woman. "I thought we could go over some options," he said, "just so you don't have to worry about any of the complicated stuff." I almost laughed. Complicated stuff. As if the home I had built, the money I had saved, the decisions I had made for decades were suddenly beyond my comprehension simply because he said so. I told him he was welcome to come by, but as soon as I hung up, I called my lawyer. "I think it's time," I told her. "I want everything in order. I want it written down, signed, and witnessed. I want there to be no question about my capacity." She didn't ask for details. She simply said, "I'll be there tomorrow." That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind tapping against the window panes. I thought about all the ways he might try to twist my intentions, about the lies he had already spread, about the pitying looks and the lowered voices. I knew that when I confronted him, there would be no going back to the illusion that we were a family bound by trust. But I also knew that if I didn't stand up now, I would lose not just my possessions, but my dignity, my identity. So I made a silent promise to myself. When the time came, and I knew it was coming soon, I would not tremble. I would not apologize for defending my own life. I would look him in the eye and remind him that I was still here, still whole, still stronger than he ever imagined. I did not sleep much that night, but as dawn crept into the room, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of clarity, a fierce, steady calm. If he wanted a confrontation, he would have it, but it would not end the way he expected. The morning after I called my lawyer, I woke earlier than usual. The air in the house felt different somehow, brisk, purposeful, as if it too understood something was about to change. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was doing more than simply reacting. I was taking back something he thought he could quietly steal, my voice. I made my coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the neat folders I had lined up beside me. Each one held a record, a receipt, a proof of my competence. Every page felt like a small shield I was assembling against a war I had never wanted but was determined to survive. My lawyer arrived mid-morning, her briefcase in hand, and her eyes clear with quiet understanding. I didn't have to explain much. She had seen this before. Sons and daughters deciding they were entitled to take over their parents' lives, dressing up greed as protection. We spent hours reviewing everything. She read each note I had written, dates, times, conversations, without interrupting. When I finished, she set her pen down and looked me in the eye. "You are not confused," she said calmly. "You are prepared." Something in my chest unknotted at those words. I didn't realize how much I had needed someone to validate what I already knew, that I wasn't losing my mind. I wasn't imagining the manipulation. Together, we drafted letters to my doctor and my financial advisor. She explained that having signed statements confirming I was of sound mind would make it far more difficult for anyone to challenge my decisions in court. I felt a strange mixture of sorrow and relief as we worked. Sorrow because it was my son who forced me to these measures. Relief because for the first time, I felt I was reclaiming control of my own story. In between signing papers and notarizing documents, I found myself thinking about my husband. He had always believed in being prepared, in never leaving anything to chance. He would have been proud of me, I thought, though he would have been devastated to see the way things had turned. By late afternoon, the table was covered with forms and affidavits, an entire paper fortress built around the truth of who I was. When we finished, my lawyer placed everything into a thick folder and slid it toward me. "This is your protection," she said quietly. "If anyone tries to claim you're not capable, you have this. Keep it somewhere safe." I thanked her, though the words felt small compared to what she had given me. Certainty. Validation. A map out of the fog my son had tried to create around me. After she left, I sat alone for a long time, tracing the edge of the folder with my fingertip. It felt heavier than anything I'd ever owned, not because of the paper inside it, but because of what it represented. Proof that no matter what stories he told, the facts were on my side. It wasn't just legal preparation I began that week. I started preparing myself emotionally too. I practiced what I would say if he confronted me. I rehearsed the words over and over until my voice no longer shook when I imagined them. I called my oldest friend, someone I trusted more than anyone still living, and told her everything. She listened without judgment, only pausing to ask, "What can I do?" "Just believe me," I whispered. "Just believe that I'm not the person he's describing." "I know exactly who you are," she replied, "and I will stand by you." Her faith steadied me more than she could have known, because by then, I understood that when your own child calls your sanity into question, it infects everything. Even the simplest tasks, making a grocery list, paying a bill, begin to feel like small tests you are terrified of failing. So I kept documenting everything, every conversation, every bank statement, every errand. Not because I doubted my own mind, but because I knew he was counting on me to second-guess myself. He was hoping that if he repeated the lie enough times, I would start to believe it. But I didn't. There were moments when I felt the old ache of love and longing, when I remembered the boy he had been, the one who used to run to me when he was scared of thunderstorms, the boy who would fall asleep with his head in my lap. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, I asked myself whether that child had ever really disappeared, or whether he was simply buried under years of entitlement and resentment. But then I would remember the cold certainty in his voice when he told my sister I was confused, the ease with which he had recited that lie. That was what finally hardened my resolve. If he could say those things so calmly, so convincingly, then he was not a man I could trust. Not anymore. I spent the next few days assembling everything I would need to protect myself. When I finally closed the folder and locked it in my desk, I felt a strange clarity, like a fog lifting after a long storm. He thought he had me cornered. He thought he could chip away at my confidence until I was too frightened to fight back. But he had mistaken my patience for weakness. He had mistaken my love for surrender. He was about to discover the difference. The day he came to the house, I woke before dawn. There was no dramatic thunderstorm, no sign from the sky to warn me this was the day everything would change. It was just a quiet morning, the kind that used to bring me comfort. But as I moved through my kitchen, pouring coffee, straightening the cushions on the sofa, I felt a tautness in my chest that told me peace was over. I had replayed this moment so many times in my mind that it felt almost rehearsed. Every word I needed to say, every question I would refuse to answer, every dignified silence I would hold in place when he tried to speak over me. I had planned it all because I knew he would try to catch me off balance, to spin confusion out of thin air if I let him. When his car pulled into the driveway, I felt my heart start to hammer in my chest. I closed my eyes and drew in a slow breath, reminding myself of every step I had taken to be ready. My medical records were in a folder on the table. My will, updated and notarized, sat beside it. The letters from my doctor and lawyer waited neatly stacked, undeniable proof that I was clear-minded and fully aware. I thought, for the smallest moment, that perhaps he would look at me and remember who I was. That he would see the mother who had stood by him when no one else did, who had stayed up all night worrying, who had given him every bit of love she had to give. Maybe, when he saw the way I held my head high, something inside him would crack, and he would finally tell the truth. But when he stepped through the door, he didn't look guilty. He looked smug, polished, like a man who believed the ending had already been written and that he was the one holding the pen. He didn't bother to greet me properly. He set down a folder of his own, took a measured breath, and launched straight into his performance. "Mom," he began, voice low and artificially calm. "I've been talking with a few people who are concerned about you. You've seemed increasingly disoriented lately. It's not just me who's noticed." I said nothing. I had decided in advance that I would let him speak first, let him show me exactly how far he was willing to take his story. He looked around the room, as if expecting to find allies hidden behind the curtains. "This isn't easy for me," he continued. "But we all agree it's time to consider a more structured living arrangement for you." I folded my hands in my lap to hide the way they were trembling. Not from fear, though a small part of me was afraid, but from the furious clarity that comes when you finally see someone without their mask. "And what exactly does that mean?" I asked quietly. He sighed, the way people sigh when they're pretending to be patient with a child. "It means assisted care, Mom. A facility, someplace safe, where you won't have to worry about all this." He gestured vaguely at the room, as though my life were an inconvenient pile of clutter. My life, my home, the place where I had raised him, taught him to tie his shoes, held him while he cried over skinned knees and teenage heartbreak. He met my eyes then, and for a moment I saw the truth in his gaze. He wasn't sorry. He wasn't worried. He was certain that he had already won. I felt something in me harden into iron. "Is that what you've decided?" I asked. My voice was so calm it startled even me. "It's not just me," he insisted quickly. "Everyone agrees. We've seen the signs. You repeat yourself, you forget things, you've been making mistakes with the bills." I raised a hand, and to my satisfaction, he stopped talking. "You've said enough," I told him. "Now you'll listen." I reached for my folder, the one I had spent weeks assembling. My hand didn't tremble as I laid it on the table. My voice didn't quaver as I began to speak. "In this folder is a letter from my physician stating that I am fully competent. There is also a record of every bill I have paid, every appointment I have kept, and every conversation we've had about my finances. I've documented each time you claimed I was confused, each time you told someone I was unfit. I've collected statements from neighbors, friends, and my attorney." I watched his mouth tighten, watched the first flicker of uncertainty cross his face. "You may believe that repeating a lie enough times makes it true," I continued, But the truth doesn't disappear just because you find it inconvenient. He tried to speak, but I cut him off. I know exactly what you're doing, I said, my voice steady and unflinching, and I will not allow you to continue. I opened the folder and slid the papers toward him one by one. He looked down, scanning the documents, and for the first time, I saw his composure falter. You think because I am your mother that I would be too ashamed to fight you, I said. You think I would rather stay quiet than admit you could do something so cruel. You were wrong. His face had gone pale. He shifted in his chair, but I kept my gaze locked on his. I will not be moved out of my home. I will not be declared incompetent, and I will not let you rewrite my life to suit your ambitions. For the first time since this began, the room was silent. No arguments, no denials, just the weight of the truth settling over us like a final verdict. I had waited a long time for this moment, and I had never been more certain that I was ready. When I reached for the envelope containing my will, a part of me felt almost weightless. Not because this moment was easy, God knows it wasn't, but because after months of doubt and dread, I finally had nothing left to hide from, nothing left to fear. This was the moment all my preparation had been building toward. He watched me closely as I unfolded the document, his eyes darting between the papers and my face, searching for any sign of weakness. But he didn't find any. If he was expecting me to tremble or weep or plead for his understanding, he was going to be disappointed. This, I began, lifting the first page so he could see it clearly, is my last will and testament, prepared and witnessed by my attorney, who has known me for 15 years. It reflects my wishes and intentions in their entirety. Nothing in here was signed under duress or confusion. His jaw tightened. I saw the twitch in his temple, the small tell that always appeared when he realized he'd miscalculated. He opened his mouth as if to interrupt, but I raised my hand, and to my satisfaction, he fell silent. You have spent months, I continued evenly, telling anyone who would listen that I am senile, that I am no longer capable of managing my own affairs, that my memory is failing. I have listened to you spread these lies, watched you wear your concern like a badge of honor, while you tried to convince everyone that you were simply protecting me. I let out a slow, steady breath, feeling my heart settle into a rhythm that felt unshakable. But the truth is that you have been protecting only yourself, your interests, your ambitions, and your desire to control what does not belong to you. He flinched, just barely, but enough for me to see it. The smallest fracture in the polished mask he wore. I turned the page deliberately, letting the rustle of the thick paper fill the silence between us. In this document, I have outlined precisely how my estate will be distributed. I have chosen to leave my home, my savings, and all my personal possessions to the people who have treated me with respect and kindness. His face paled a shade. You, I went on, locking eyes with him, will not be receiving anything. His mouth opened again, reflex, protest, but I continued before he could find his words. That is not a punishment, I said, my voice soft but unyielding. It is simply the natural consequence of your choices. You chose to diminish me. You chose to lie about me. You chose to treat me as an obstacle rather than a person, and I will not reward that behavior. He swallowed, and I saw his eyes flick to the door, as if he was considering fleeing the conversation altogether. But I wasn't finished. Furthermore, I continued, lifting another document, here is the letter from my physician, dated and signed, confirming that I am in full possession of my mental faculties, that I am capable of making my own decisions, of managing my own finances, of living independently. This is not a matter of opinion, it is a matter of record. I placed it gently in front of him. The paper made a soft sound against the table, somehow louder than any shout. You have been telling people I am confused, I said, my voice low. But the only confusion here is yours, believing that you could take my autonomy without consequence. I watched the color rise in his face, the embarrassment and fury warring behind his eyes. But I felt no pity for him. I had spent too many nights wondering what I had done to deserve this betrayal. Too many mornings second-guessing my own memory, wondering if I was the problem. Now I knew better. "You have mistaken my love for weakness," I said. "You have mistaken my patience for permission." He let out a shaky breath, and his voice, when he finally found it, was smaller than I'd ever heard it. "I was just trying to help you." "No," I said quietly. "You were trying to help yourself." For a moment, we simply looked at each other across the table. I thought about the boy he used to be, the child with skinned knees and bright eyes who once believed I could fix anything. And I thought about the man sitting in front of me now, who had traded that trust for control. "I don't expect you to understand," I said finally, "but I do expect you to accept that this conversation is over." He glanced at the papers again, as if hoping the words might rearrange themselves into something more forgiving. But the truth was laid out in black and white. Irrefutable. "I will not be moved," I said simply. "I will not be declared incompetent, and I will not be erased." His shoulders sagged, and for the first time, I saw something almost like fear in his eyes. He knew he'd lost. Not just the argument, but the illusion of power he'd clung to so desperately. I stood slowly, gathering the documents and placing them back in their folder. My hands were steady. My mind was clear. I had spent months preparing for this moment, and as I looked at him, this man I had raised, this man who thought he could strip me of my dignity, I felt no regret. I was done being silent, done allowing someone else to tell my story. When I spoke again, my voice was softer than before, but it carried all the weight of everything I had endured. "This is my life," I said, "and you do not get to decide how it ends." When the last word left my mouth, it was as if the entire house exhaled with me. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The papers between us seemed to glow with their own quiet power. I think, in that instant, he finally understood that he had miscalculated me entirely. I had worried, in the weeks leading up to that conversation, that I would feel relief when it was over, that some part of me would unclench and I would be free of the tight knot in my chest. But what I felt instead was something more complicated, a mingling of sorrow and finality, the knowledge that this moment could never be undone. He stared at me, his eyes hollow. Perhaps he was searching for the softness he had always relied upon, the mother who would soothe and forgive, no matter how deep the betrayal. But I was no longer willing to be that woman for him. I would not make this easier by pretending everything could return to normal. Finally, he spoke, his voice a ragged whisper. "You don't mean this. You can't." I held his gaze. I have never meant anything more in my life. The words seemed to land like a stone in his gut. He looked away, blinking hard, and I wondered whether he was replaying every step that had brought us to this place. Whether, in the privacy of his own heart, he felt even a shred of shame. But whatever remorse he might have felt, he didn't voice it. Instead, he took a slow, shuddering breath and began to gather his own folder of papers, the ones he had brought to bolster his fiction. His hands shook as he slid the documents back inside, and for the first time in all these months, he did not try to correct me, or belittle me, or suggest that I was imagining things. I let the silence stretch. There was nothing else I needed to say. The record of my life, my competence, my right to exist on my own terms was laid out in undeniable detail. He could no longer pretend that he held the power here. When he finally stood, he looked older than I had ever seen him. The smooth confidence had drained away, replaced by something brittle and uncertain. I felt no triumph in it, only a weary kind of clarity. He cleared his throat as if to speak again, but the words never came. Instead, he turned for the door, the folder clutched to his chest like a shield. For a moment, he paused in the doorway, and I wondered whether he would turn back, whether there was any apology waiting on his tongue. But he didn't look at me. He stepped out into the gray afternoon, and the door closed behind him with a dull click that felt like a final punctuation mark. I stood in the quiet that followed, listening to my own heartbeat. The house felt different now, emptied of something heavy, as if all the tension and dread had finally lifted, leaving behind only the truth of what had happened between us. I didn't cry. Perhaps there would be tears later, grief for the relationship I had lost, for the trust that could never be restored. But in that moment, I felt something closer to peace. I gathered my papers carefully, returning them to the folder that had become my shield. As I did, my eyes fell on an old photograph tucked between two sheets, a picture of my son at 5 years old, grinning up at me with his first missing tooth. My hand hovered over it for a long moment. I thought about the little boy he used to be, the child who believed I could fix anything, and I thought about the man he had become, who believed he could break me without consequence. I slipped the photograph back into its place and closed the folder. Some part of me would always love the memory of that boy, but I no longer needed to excuse the man. The phone rang just as I was setting everything in the drawer. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but something in me wanted to hear a voice that wasn't his, to be reminded that the world still held people who would speak to me with respect. It was my friend on the other end, the one who had promised she would stand by me. "Well?" she asked, her voice gentle. "It's done," I said, and as I spoke the words, I felt them settle into my bones, solid, irrevocable. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. I closed my eyes. For the first time in a long while, I believed I could be proud of myself too. After we hung up, I moved slowly through the house, touching the things that were mine: framed photographs, worn cookbooks, the small wooden box where I kept my wedding ring. These were the pieces of a life I had built through decades of sacrifice and devotion. A life no one, no matter how entitled, had the right to take from me. I knew the coming days would not be easy. There would be more conversations, more looks of pity or disbelief from people who hadn't seen the truth up close. But I no longer cared about their opinions. The only thing that mattered was that I had chosen to stand firm. I had reclaimed my name, my story, and my dignity. And no matter what came next, I would not surrender them again. That evening, when the sun began to sink behind the hedges, I made myself a cup of tea and sat in my favorite chair by the window. It was the first time in months that I allowed myself to sit without an agenda. No notebooks to fill, no papers to review, no strategies to rehearse. I watched the light slip across the floor, turning the walls the color of old honey. The house was quiet, and for the first time, the silence didn't feel oppressive. It felt earned. I thought of everything I had survived to reach this moment. The loneliness that settled into the corners of the rooms after my husband died. The slow, creeping dread as I realized my son was rewriting the story of who I was. The exhaustion of having to prove again and again that I was not confused, not incompetent, not some fragile creature to be handled. And then I thought of the relief, clean and undeniable, that had washed through me when I told the truth out loud, without apology. For so long, I had been afraid that standing up for myself would mean losing him forever. That if I drew a line, he would walk away, and there would be no coming back. And maybe that's exactly what will happen. Maybe this was the last conversation we will ever have that isn't conducted through lawyers or letters. But as I sat there, letting the tea grow cold in my hands, I realized that sometimes there is no way back to the person you once loved. Sometimes you must let the door close for good, because standing in that doorway, hoping for an apology that will never come, is more dangerous than walking away. I won't pretend it didn't break my heart, but it also made something in me stronger. For anyone listening to this story, for anyone who has felt that same slow erosion of their own confidence under the weight of someone else's ambition, I want you to hear me clearly. You are not obligated to make yourself small to preserve another person's comfort. You do not owe your silence to the ones who misrepresent your worth. You do not have to hand over the keys to your life simply because someone insists they know better. There will be people who hear this and say, I overreacted, that I should have forgiven him, that I should have accepted his help, that I should have been grateful that he was willing to take on responsibility I never asked him to assume. But those people have never felt the cold certainty of betrayal from someone whose face you once kissed goodnight. They don't know what it feels like to have your competence questioned so often that you start to question it yourself. They don't know what it costs to stand in a room with someone you love and tell them, without flinching, that you will no longer participate in the story they are writing about you. And they will never understand the quiet triumph of reclaiming your own narrative. I have spent a lifetime caring for other people: my husband, my son, my friends, my neighbors. I do not regret a single day of that devotion, but I will not spend the final chapters of my life apologizing for existing. If you take nothing else from my story, let it be this: no one gets to decide your worth. No one gets to diminish your voice without your permission, and no one, no matter how close to your heart, has the right to erase you. We are taught, especially as we grow older, to make ourselves agreeable, to keep the peace, to defer, to nod, to accept whatever others insist is best for us. We are taught that it is noble to sacrifice our own dignity so no one else feels uncomfortable. But I am here to tell you that there is nothing noble about surrendering your life to someone else's convenience. There is strength in kindness, yes, but there is also strength in boundaries. There is courage in love, but there is also courage in saying enough. And there is dignity in forgiveness, but there is also dignity in closing the door and choosing your own peace over someone else's approval. I don't know what the future holds for my relationship with my son. Maybe he will reflect on his choices and find remorse. Maybe he will continue to believe he was justified. That is no longer my burden to carry. What matters to me is that I did not allow his version of events to become the only one. That when the moment came to speak, I did not waver. As the last light of day slipped away, I felt something like gratitude for every moment that taught me the cost of silence, and for every lesson that showed me the value of my own voice. I took one last sip of my tea, now lukewarm but comforting in its own way, and I felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing that whatever came next, I would meet it on my own terms. And to anyone who feels alone in this kind of struggle, I want you to know, you are not alone. Your story matters, your truth matters, and your life belongs to you, no matter who tries to claim otherwise.